Our guest of the evening is New York City mayoral candidate, Shaun Donovan. Welcome to the show, sir.
AJ, great to be on. I'm really excited. I have been keeping in touch with you, and I'm glad to be joining you tonight.
Yes. And shout out to the whole CCM and the whole fellowship and that is doing their best to further community media, which made it possible for us to have a forum with y'all. And, you're the second interview we're doing from the race. So we interviewed Eric Adams a while back, trying to see if we can get Maya Wiley soon too. But one of the things that I wanted you to, because I couldn't remember exactly all the details, you worked with the Obama administration. I'm sure that's something that my audience would love to hear about. So what did you do? And I know you were part of that administration.
Well, I was proud to be in President Obama's cabinet all 8 years. I was his housing secretary for the first 5.5 years. And then I was his budget director over the $4 trillion federal budget the last 2.5 years. And, it taught me something about leading through moments of crisis like we're facing right now. You remember this, AJ. When I became housing secretary, we were suffering through the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes. Half of Black wealth in this country had been stolen by predatory lending. And President Obama asked me to come in, keep people in their homes, and rebuild that wealth, rebuild our economy. And that was how I got started. As if that wasn't enough, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, he asked me to lead the entire recovery. And then I guess because no good deed goes unpunished, he asked me to be the budget director when we were facing the worst budget deficit since World War II. And think about this, just 3 weeks after I started as budget director, Ebola hit, and then later Zika. I ended up working side by side with Dr. Fauci in the Situation Room with President Obama, with then Vice President Biden, making sure those global health threats didn't become pandemics that would have cost 30,000 New Yorkers their lives. So I know something about leading through crisis, and that's what we need at City Hall right now in New York.
So I wanted to get that out the way, but let me go backwards a little bit. So tell everybody who you are, why you're running, and why they should vote for you.
Absolutely. So, AJ, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I'm actually the son of an immigrant who grew up in Costa Rica and Lima, Peru. And the reason I became a public servant is because when I was growing up in New York, I watched homelessness exploding on the streets. I watched the South Bronx, Central Brooklyn literally burning to the ground. And that was what lit a fire in me to go to work on behalf of the city that I love, that I owe everything to. And so think about this. When I was a student, I read about a remarkable leader named Bishop Johnny Ray Youngblood, who was working with the East Brooklyn congregations, South Bronx churches to build 5,000 Nehemiah homes out of the rubble, literally, of the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn. And I was so moved by his work. I came to him and I said, put me to work, Reverend. And he did. And I started working for a nonprofit in the Bronx, rebuilding those same neighborhoods I'd seen burning as a kid. So I have national experience and citywide experience, but I also have experience that started on the ground, rebuilding Black and brown communities in this city, building wealth through the Nehemiah homes. And that's how I got started. And so for me, what we need at this moment to be mayor is 3 things. We need someone who has a bold vision for how to make New York a more equitable city. We need someone who has the experience to actually make that vision real in the everyday lives of New Yorkers. And we need a change from the last 8 years of political status quo. Other candidates have had their chance these last 8 years to make real progress on equity. And we need somebody who's going to take the city in a new and better direction. That's what I'm ready to do as mayor, and that's why I'm running.
Bob.
So welcome, Mr. Donovan. It's a pleasure to have you on air.
So real quick, so yes, you know me, AJ Woodson, my partner Damon K. Jones. We started this together. We have 2 co-hosts, Dr. Bob, and shout out to Lorraine Lopez. Damon and Lorraine are not here today, so I definitely wanted to make sure I give them their shout outs. Go ahead, Bob.
Yes. So it's a pleasure to have someone with such a wealth of experience on the show. I must say that given your extensive experience, no one could ever accuse you of not having the technocratic chops that are required to make one of the world's largest economies, municipalities function properly. I included in the chat bar a link to your nearly 200-page plan. So there's a lot of details here. Obviously, we can't wade through all of them right now, but I was curious. I see that you have high up on your list of policy objectives, policies that are going to promote greater racial equity in the city. And I'm curious to know, exactly what are some of the details of that proposal, because if anything, the COVID epidemic has made it very obvious to everyone that these are very deep, entrenched inequities, and that we're going to have to do something to mitigate them if we, are going to have some resilience as a society.
Yeah. Well, Bob, let me just start off by saying you're absolutely right that COVID has exposed those inequities, but the truth is that those who are most vulnerable before a crisis hits are always hurt the worst by it, right? Katrina, Sandy, the mortgage crisis. And so I'm outraged by what we've seen with COVID, but I'm not surprised. And the other thing I would say, Bob, is, this work is part of me. Literally 30 years ago this week, I sat down and had dinner with John Lewis, and the next morning set off to retrace the route of the Freedom Rides on the 30th anniversary. Right now, literally as we're talking tonight, is the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Rides from Washington, D.C. through the South. And so this work on racial equity is part of me. It's something I've been doing for my entire career. It's one of the reasons I went into housing to begin with. And it is you're absolutely right. It's at the core of the work that I want to do as mayor. And here's the thing, Bob. You can predict the life chances of a child, even their life expectancy, by the zip code they grow up in. And that is wrong. We have to end that in the city. And while equity is a part of every one of my policies, here are three key things that I would do as mayor. First, I would make sure your zip code doesn't determine your destiny. And I would do that through what I call 15-minute neighborhoods. So what's a 15-minute neighborhood? I would change the way we plan and invest in our city so that every person in New York has within 15 minutes of their front door everything they need for opportunity. A great school for your kids, a job that sustains your family, housing you can afford. But also look at COVID. We need to have healthcare facilities in every single community. We need all of the things that will make sure you're not disproportionately likely to catch COVID or to die from it. Fresh food, a park, get rid of environmental pollution. All of those things have to be part of how we plan every single community for 15-minute neighborhoods. So that's one. Second, you all know that the wealth gap is one of the most important drivers of inequality and racial inequality specifically. The average Black family has 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. And so how do we change that? It's called equity bonds. Every child born in the city gets $1,000. And by the way, big shout out to Cory Booker here. I worked with him on this proposal with Derek Hamilton in New York, who originated the idea of baby bonds. This is building on that. Every child born in the city, $1,000 in an account. Every year until they graduate high school, up to $2,000 more, depending on their income. That means a child born into poverty in New York City graduates high school with almost $50,000 in an account to go to college, to buy a home, to start a business. That would fundamentally change the game in New York in terms of racial equity. And then the last thing, I would appoint the city's first ever chief equity officer reporting directly to me, because every issue is an issue of equity. And that chief equity officer would have authority over every one of the agencies. First time we'd ever have that in New York City, to really make sure that we're living up to the promises that I'm making around racial equity. So those are three key things that I would do to make sure not just that we repair and rebuild the city, but that we reimagine it as a city that actually works for everyone.
So let me clarify, Shaun, because I want to be sure that our audience gets the gist of the proposal. It isn't that the equity bonds are exclusively for African Americans, but rather it's a kind of means tested kind of approach based on income. So everyone's going to get at least a minimum of $1,000 a year in the form of a bond. But if you find yourself from one of the, on the lower segment of the economic ladder, you'll get more, which invariably means that African Americans are going to disproportionately benefit because we are disproportionately on the lower end of the economic totem pole, along with others.
That's correct. And again, let's be clear about how disproportionate it is. Typical Black family, 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. So this would fundamentally go at what I think is the most intense driver of inequality in the city. And look, this is the lesson I learned starting work on the Nehemiah homes 30 years ago. Almost all the folks who moved into those Nehemiah homes came directly out of public housing, built wealth. The Black families, brown families in Brownsville, in East New York, in the South Bronx. Today, you go back 30 years later, owning that home has fundamentally changed that couple's life, their children's life, their grandchildren's life. We talk a lot about displacement and gentrification in the city. Black and brown folks being pushed out. Home ownership and wealth building is one powerful tool to make sure that people can not only stay in New York, but actually find opportunity. And that's why I want to focus on it.
You talk about gentrification. We're facing a lot of that here in Westchester County. Possibility of that in the city of Mount Vernon, which borders the Bronx, which is where I live. I know in Greenburgh, they're redoing some the apartments, and they're relocating the seniors, and they said they will get first choice to come back. And the percentage of Section 8, the percentage they pay now of their rent with the Section 8 voucher, they will pay then. But the percentage of $900 as opposed to $1,900, I'm just making up figures, is a great big difference. So even though you're giving them first crack, you said we're not displacing them, you're outpricing them, which is the very definition of displacement. We have a lot of those topics going on right now, even here in Westchester.
AJ, not only do you have them happening right now, this has been a fight in Westchester that I took on. I don't know if you remember this. When I started as HUD secretary, Rob Astorino was proposing putting all the affordable housing, all of it, basically in one Black neighborhood in Yonkers. It was crazy. And so I did something that was very unusual. I joined a lawsuit that was being brought locally to stop him doing that. And you remember Astorino actually ran for governor on this platform, said we were engaging in social engineering. Wait a second. Like, what history books are you reading? How did we create segregated Black neighborhoods in the first place? With social engineering, right? With redlining, with that whole history. And so what I did, this was the first step I took to really enforce what's called affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I also actually led with something, it's called disparate impact, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. It's a really foundational part of civil rights law. Basically what it says is you don't have to prove intentional discrimination for something to be illegal. And if you think about all of the ways that predatory lenders targeted Black and brown folks, the devastation that was done, disparate impact was a really important piece of how we do that. Here's the thing. President Biden was in Tulsa a few days ago, and at the center of his racial equity platform was those two things, affirmatively furthering fair housing and disparate impact. He revived the work that I did as HUD secretary and that was destroyed by President Trump. You remember last year when President Trump was running? He accused Joe Biden of destroying the suburbs. You remember that? That was my work as HUD secretary that he was talking about, to try to make sure that every American in Westchester, in New York City, across this country could live wherever they choose. That's the work that I've been leading on for my career.
Yeah, I'm glad, because even though you're running in the city, a great portion of our audience is Westchester, and I knew of the Rob Astorino situation, and I knew that you could speak to that, and that's why I definitely, and shout out to Community Voices. Heard they pushed the investigation against Astorino's illegal affordable housing agenda. They were on the forefront of that here. So shout out to all of them as well.
Love CVH. Afia Adametsa done work with on public housing, so many other things in the city. And they're real leaders in New York, in the city, across the entire state. So I'm glad you shouted them out, AJ.
Absolutely. Now, I've been watching some of the debates, candidate forums, Spectrum One, and there was a few other ones. And affordable housing and homelessness, and those are the two key things here too, are among the top of everybody's concern. I know, and I'm not sure if it was you, I know one of the candidates spoke on all of the vacant hotels and properties in the city and utilizing that to increase to combat the homelessness and affordable housing. I'm not sure if that was your agenda that you spoke on. Was it?
I have talked about that quite a bit, AJ. It's a real, President Obama used to say we cannot let a crisis go to waste. We absolutely should be looking at vacant office space, vacant hotels to convert to affordable housing and to dramatically increase the ability of New Yorkers to stay in the city and to afford. Look, here's the thing. We've got the worst eviction crisis potentially in the history of the city on our hands. We still have 500,000 New Yorkers who are out of work, and we need somebody who really knows how to solve those issues. I worked after the Great Recession. I mentioned, when the mortgage crisis hit, I created programs that kept more than 10 million families in their homes. And we need to focus on that right now. Get rental assistance into the hands of we need legal assistance, housing counseling to help them make sure they're not losing in housing court and being evicted. And so those are things we need to do right now, but we also need to increase the amount of affordable housing longer term. And that's something, look, one of the things that's different about me from any of the other candidates is I know how to go to Washington and get the money that we need. This is like a New Deal moment, right? I mean, we might have $5 trillion in federal assistance get passed this year. And just like Fiorello LaGuardia transformed New York because he was mayor during the original New Deal and worked with FDR, who was in the White House, to bring a huge share of that money to New York. That's what I could do at this moment. We need a mayor who really understands how to go and finally get the help we deserve from Washington. And that includes housing assistance. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that could be available for housing if you know where to look and you know how to get it done.
And in addition to the affordable housing, one of the major issues that keeps coming up, that has come up way before now, but definitely comes up in this election cycle, is NYCHA and discriminatory practices and a lot of that stuff. And I know you have a few thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Look, public housing is the most precious affordable housing resource we have in New York. Think about this. More people live in public housing in New York than live in Atlanta, Georgia. And yet we've never really had a mayor who treats public housing like the precious resource that it is. And so here's what I would do. I would put the public housing at the center of my housing plan. I would commit $2 billion a year of city capital, far more than any other candidate. And I would make sure that that was the first step in getting to $40 billion that we need to fix public housing. I think we can get more than 30 billion of that from Washington. As I said, I could unlock that better than any other candidate. But here's the other thing too, AJ. If you live in public housing, here's what happens right now. You got a leak in your shower. By the time the 15 different people who need to sign off all the way to headquarters of NYCHA right next to City Hall, by the time that happens, 6 months later, a year later, that leak has turned into asthma that's causing your kid it turned into mold that's causing your kid asthma, right? It's broken through the ceiling downstairs and is now hurting the health and the sanity of the family downstairs. We need to fundamentally change the way we manage public housing too, so that the folks who are on site have the real authority, the knowledge, the tools to get things fixed quickly. So it's the money, but it's also the way that it's managed. It is broken right now. And look, you said earlier, Bob, I bring deep experience in how to make government actually work. And we need someone who's going to bring not just compassion, but also competence back to City Hall at this moment.
We got a couple of Westchester people. Sandy Barnaby said, I wish he could help Mount Vernon. And Stephanie Swanson said, also with the Greenberg Housing Federal residents. The question that I wanted to ask, we hear all the candidates talk about these plans to do this and how much it's going to cost and these and how much they're going to dedicate to everything. And very few times do I hear them say, how are they going to pay for it? And where's the money going to come from? Which is a good concern, because the other side is, always putting that we're spending too much money here and there, even though they give tax cuts to themselves. But,
Yeah, well, AJ, I think what voters in New York should ask is who's actually walked the walk, not just talk the talk, right? People forget this after 4 years of Donald Trump. But when Barack Obama became president, we faced the worst budget deficit since World War II. By the time I finished as budget director, we'd reduced that deficit faster than any time since World War II, while still making huge investments in housing, in healthcare, in jobs. So I have a track record of being able to both invest in big things that are going to make New York stronger, more equitable, but also to be able to manage the budget side so that we can afford it. Look, part of this, I said it before, we have a huge opportunity to bring new resources from DC. This is a New Deal moment, and we need a mayor who can capture that. But the other thing is, look at all the places where we're spending money with terrible results. Let me give you one very specific example. Rikers Island. Just take a guess, Bob, AJ, how much do you think we spend per person at Rikers Island right now? Just take a guess.
50,000?
A couple of $100,000?
$430,000 a year per person at Rikers.
Yeah, wait, I want to stop you real quick. We say that here in Westchester. I forgot what it costs to keep someone in Valhalla, but it costs a third of that to send them to the community college.
Right.
So I just
sound like you can send like 50 people to community college.
That's right. And buy them a home at the same time, right? But here's the thing. The same is true of homelessness. We're spending $3 billion a year putting a giant Band-Aid on the problem with emergency shelters and hotels when we know how to solve it, right? Think about this, under Mayor de Blasio, and this is part of why violence is getting out of control in the city. The number of people sleeping on the streets and in shelter has doubled under Mayor de Blasio. The mental health epidemic we're seeing playing out on our streets, on our subways, it's a powerful change that we need a mayor who can actually solve. When I was housing commissioner in the city, we brought the number of individuals sleeping on the street and shelter down by 30%. And when I led the strategy for President Obama, we actually reduced street and family homelessness by a quarter around the country. And I got a big shout out to Michelle Obama. We ended veteran homelessness in 80 cities, not reduced it, but ended it. And we not only saved lives, we saved money because we were investing in what's called supportive housing, right? Which combines housing with the mental health, the substance abuse services that people need. That's what breaks the cycle of incarceration, of mental health challenges. It saves lives and it saves money. Those are the kinds of things that we could actually do that would make New York a city, like I said, that works for everyone.
Bob.
So I want to go back to your tenure in the Obama administration, Shaun, because as you well know, it will give us some insights. Of course, the Obama administration's response to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis was ultimately at the decision of the president. And one of the real criticisms that he's received, and that seems to have touched off the wave of populist discontent that we're living with, was clear favoritism that was shown towards the banks in terms of the quantitative easing policy that seemed to make Wall Street repair Wall Street, but left Main Street in a state of continued disrepair. The policy, the responsibility for the policy is not yours. I'm curious to know if you advocated for alternative approaches to restore the American economy, and in particular, the kind of programs that were especially popular amongst the progressive circles in which I like to count myself, that call for putting more money directly into the hands of homeowners. Is that what was your stance on this? What did you advocate for?
So, Bob, if you look back at that history, I was one of those who really pushed early on to do more buying down of people's mortgages, reducing not just what they had to pay every month, but also what they owed on those mortgages. And in the end, we did reach more than 10 million families to help keep them in their homes. I created something called the Neighborhood Stabilization Program that invested in the communities that were hardest hit, where there were vacant homes, to fix them up, work with nonprofits. And the other thing you might remember, I led the strategy that got $50 billion from the banks as part of the mortgage settlement. I actually worked very closely with Kamala Harris when she was Attorney General at the time, and partnered with her to hold the banks accountable and get money directly to those folks. Now, I wasn't the Treasury Secretary. I wasn't the Attorney General. I did, as HUD Secretary, lead the prosecution of a number of the folks who misused loans, who targeted predatory lending. But I also made sure that we were helping folks directly get the assistance that they needed. And look, this is part of the reason that I think President Obama hired me in the first place. When I was housing commissioner in the city, I created something called the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. It was the first response by any city in the country that brought together housing counseling, legal services, and real financial assistance to keep people in their homes. Because you remember this, Bob, like the number of families, I sat at kitchen tables with families, bills building up on the kitchen table, embarrassed, shameful even to ask for help. And so what we needed to do locally, and then what I did nationally, was to get billions of dollars into legal assistance, into mortgage write-downs, and into the kind of housing counseling that help people stay in their homes. And that's what we need. A different version of that is playing out right now in New York, right? We've got an eviction crisis because we have still hundreds of thousands of people out of work. We got to get money directly to those folks and help to them as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. I'm moving around a little bit. I know one of the things we've been dealing with here in Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, and Yonkers lately, and I've had the last couple of shows, is senseless gun violence. And I know that you addressed an incident of a 10-year-old boy, I guess in Far Rockaway, I think it was. And I asked you to speak a little bit on that because even though I'm speaking about it as a local issue, I believe this has the potential to be one of the worst summers if we don't get a hold of this senseless gun violence in our community this year.
AJ, you are so right. Absolutely tragic. A 10-year-old shot and killed by a stray bullet in the Rockaways. It just, and frankly, it is happening more and more in the city. We saw gun violence double last year in New York. And so this is absolutely something we got to get our arms around. I grew up in New York when there were 2,000 murders a year, and we can't go back there. We have to just solve not just the gun violence, but the underlying causes of violence and hopelessness in our communities as well. So look, one of the things we got to do is get the guns off the street. And you know this, we're not manufacturing guns in New York City. Folks aren't buying them legally. in our stores in New York. They're coming in from rogue gun dealers out of state, and we need a mayor who has the relationships with the attorney general, with all our national law enforcement agencies, but also with mayors and governors around the region, around the country, who can build a coalition to stop the flow of guns into the city. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to really stem the causes. The other thing I would just say, I was actually just out in Brownsville today, and there are amazing organizations, the God Squad, many organizations that are working to build trust with young people in our communities, to break the cycle of gang violence. We need to be investing in those kind of approaches that make a huge difference. And I'm the one candidate in the race who's got a plan to get to $3 billion of investment in those kind of efforts. Here's something I did as housing commissioner. I gave housing to folks coming out of Rikers. And I took some real criticism. Some people said, what are you doing giving housing to criminals? But here's the thing. A year later, more than 90% of those folks were stably housed. They'd gotten back to work. They hadn't committed another crime. It was so successful, it's now been replicated in almost 40 cities around the country. Those are the kinds of investments we got to reinvest in our communities to break the cycle of hopelessness and violence, as well as attacking gun violence directly and getting the guns off the street. That's what's really going to make a difference long term.
We have a couple of organizations here locally. One is SNUG, which is gun spelled backwards, and we have another organization, Save Mount Vernon. Those two are doing great work and reaching out to our community. It's definitely something we've been addressing a lot, and I've been really campaigning that. Campaign is campaign season, but I guess I've been campaigning that we need our residents. We need to get more involved, and we really need to tackle the situation, because again, we're coming upon what could be a perfect storm. You know, we have a lot of inmates who was released because of COVID or for the bail reform, and they didn't come out to stimulus checks and extended unemployment checks. And if they can't find jobs, what do you think some of them are going to do? And then, you know, some of it was peaceful for a while because everybody was inside, but now the restrictions are left, and now everybody's coming out. And, you know, we all know when the mercury rises, you know, the gun violence rises as well. So, you know, when you put all those things together, we could have a perfect storm this summer if we don't get.
Absolutely. And AJ, when you mix into that the mental health challenges we've seen, COVID, the isolation, look, Rikers is the biggest mental health facility in the country. It's crazy. And we're not treating the root causes of this violence. Here's why. I talked earlier about supportive housing. The other day I was getting off the subway in New York, and a young man named Willie Boyd walked up to me. And he told me that his dad had been a veteran, had served his country, and had fallen into a cycle of mental illness, of drug abuse. And the thing that saved his life was supportive housing. And again, what that is, it's permanent housing. It's not a shelter where, you know, open air drug markets, you know, big rooms with lots of beds where you have violence. This is individual rooms with the housing and services you need on site, right? So it's got mental health services, it's got substance abuse, and it really does end the cycle of mental health and other challenges. Right now, we're expecting people to get well while they're living on our streets or at Rikers. And the other thing we need to do is make sure that we're directing people immediately to that when they get out. Right now, they're just falling through the cracks, ending up on our streets and in shelter. And that's part of the cycle of violence and mental illness that we're seeing playing out on our streets right now.
I want to thank you for your time, of course. And I know you have a lot of other things to do. But before you go, without necessarily maybe taking shots of the other candidates, I mean, there's a whole basketball team running for mayor. Explain why you specifically are the candidate that people need to vote for. If anybody's interested in knowing more about you, find out about your campaign, how would they reach out to your campaign, all that good stuff?
Thanks, AJ. And look, I am so grateful to be on. I was really inspired by your work when we had the forum, and I've been eager to get on and spend a little time with you, get to know folks. Obviously, we got a bunch of Westchester folks. Hopefully, we got a few in the Bronx watching as well. And,
yes,
and
yes,
and I would love to have your first choice vote. Voting starts on June 12th. So election day, June 22nd, is the last day, not the first day that you should vote. So please get out. I mentioned John Lewis earlier. You know, he said the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It's the single most powerful tool we have, nonviolent tool in a democratic society. And so I'd urge everyone, New York City resident or otherwise, to get out and vote. And look, here's why I would want to earn your support. We have a bunch of candidates who have some big, bold ideas. We have other candidates who bring experience to the table. And I'm the only candidate that actually combines those. I have the biggest, boldest ideas around equity bonds, around 15-minute neighborhoods to actually make the city more equitable. But at the same time, I've actually made progress on those issues. You can't call yourself progressive unless you've actually made progress on inequality and racial equity. And so I bring both those, and I bring real change. Again, lots of other candidates in the race, they've been part of the political status quo the last 8 years. I haven't. I'm going to bring fresh ideas and deep experience, especially in crisis, in a way that would allow me to not just repair and rebuild the city, but reimagine it as a city that works for everyone. That's me.
I have two questions that I ask candidates that have nothing to do with the campaign and just to break up the monotony. So the question number one is, if your house is on fire, you can only grab three things. What would they be?
Only three things?
Yes.
Wow. Well, one of them would be my portrait of John Lewis that hangs on my wall. You know, I would have to say that there is a picture of my son. He's a soccer player, just graduated from college. And I have a picture of him after his greatest game he ever played. I was in high school, actually, and that I treasure. I would take that with me as well. And then I'd have to take a few of my favorite albums from my record collection. Songs in the Key of Life would probably be number one on that list.
Okay.
Why don't you get better than that?
Yes. And lastly, if you were a superhero, who would you be and why?
Well, you know, Ed Norton is supporting my campaign, so I should probably say the Incredible Hulk.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That's good. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want everybody to know? And again, I don't know if you gave your contact information and website and stuff.
ShaunForNYC.com. ShaunForNYC.com. Go there, check it out. We'd love to have your support. Read about the campaign of ideas that we're running, all of the issues on racial equity that we've talked about tonight, but read about the ways that I've actually put those plans into action too. So love being here, AJ. Thank you, Bob, and hope to join you again soon.
And it's a pleasure having you. Best of luck.
Definitely best of luck. And should you emerge as the winner, even though we're outside of the district, the area that you would be covering mostly, I hope you feel free to, come back and let us know your progress, what's going on, and, use us as a means to getting the word out.
I'm making you a promise tonight. When I'm mayor, I'm coming back on the show, and I look forward to it.
Okay. All right. Have a good one. Thank you for your time.
Big elbow bump to both of you.
Oh,
elbow bump. Pleasure, man.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.